recorded on reserve funds from boredom to excitement. And our speakers for today are Chris Bischoff, the KDLA Regional Library Consultant for the North Central region, as well as Mark Adler, the Director of the Paris-Bourbon County Public Library. We would like to also thank and acknowledge LSTA, the Library Sciences and Technology Act, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, for their support of KDLA. So without further ado, we will begin today's presentation. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I just want to start off with, for those who know me, I tend to go with very prosaic session titles, and this subtitle, From Boredom to Excitement, came from Mark Adler. So when we do this together, and we've done this several times, I always put him firmly in charge of taking us from the boredom to excitement. So I'll handle the boredom, Mark will handle the excitement.
You know, Chris, what could be more exciting than talking about money and reserves? You're speechless.
I am speechless.
Okay.
Well, Mark is here for the obvious reason that he is a library director, and this is something that he has to deal with. I kind of ease into participating in conversations like this through my role as state library construction consultant. So I was party to capital planning conversations over the years when I was traveling around the state. And because it's something that I got into through that avenue, I've continued to track this issue once I became a regional. So that's why I'm here. Take it away, Mark.
I'm here because, as you mentioned, Chris, I am a library director in the trenches. I have the good fortune that we actually do have some reserves, and and I have to say I'm excited about that. I feel very responsible to our taxpayers and responsible for reporting the reserves in such a way that our taxpayers and our elected officials can really try to understand what we're doing with the money that we are bringing in through our tax revenue. It is an important responsibility that we have, and the fact that I have reserves certainly shores our library up in some very important ways and gives us a sense of liquidity should we have any kind of emergencies that we need to handle or any capital improvements that we're planning for. So I take it seriously. I know you do as well, Chris, and this I think is our third time doing this presentation together, and it came organically out of some discussions that we'd been having with other directors and then a representative of the financial community as well. So with that, you'll see the disclaimer on here. I'll speak for myself and Chris. Neither of us are attorneys. Obviously, if you have questions, don't assume that what we're telling you is legally correct. If you need legal advice, you should consult the advice of the library's attorney. If your library has not retained an attorney, I recommend that you do so.
Okay, so this conversation came about from a question from a library director about 4 years ago. She requested that KDLA come up with an example policy. She had also talked to Mark, and we put together a little group to look into creating an example policy that people could use to build their own local policy. Just to define a few terms, reserve funds they're kind of the equivalent in your home economy of just your savings. So it's all the money left over at the end of the fiscal year. So, and usually it'll carry over from year to year. It's not a particular bank account. It's all money in all types of accounts, including checking, savings, CDs, whatever. The reserve funds do not need to be kept together and may be distributed across a variety of accounts. But the easiest way to determine what your reserve fund level would be is at midnight on June 30th, you just see how much money your library has at the end of the fiscal year, and that would be legally, I think, how DLG would consider your reserve. Does that sound right to you, Mark?
It does, and we all know that even though that's our reserve, on July 1st we still need to operate. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward.
Mark, I think you talk about this.
Okay. Well, as it mentions, there is no requirement that you spend all the money that you bring in by the end of the year, and strategically, it would make sense that you might not do so. If you spent every single penny that you had, if there's a lightning strike and you have to deal with remediation, obviously you're going to need some liquid funds to deal with that. If you spend every penny, you don't have that money available. Also, more importantly, I think most of us are extremely reliant upon the tax revenue that we bring in, and we really don't receive our first tax check until December. We've gotten it as late as January here in Bourbon County and as early as November, but December is our usual date. With that in mind, we need upwards of 6 months of operating expenses in the bank in our reserves to use, to pull from, until we actually get our money for the fiscal year. So an important caveat is that you need to remember that library funds really are brought in for the sole purpose of providing library service. You don't want to accumulate excessive reserve funds, and what's excessive to one person may not be excessive to another. So terms like that are somewhat nebulous. But as we move forward, what we're hoping that you'll understand is that regardless of what you're doing, you need to make sure that other people understand clearly what the rationale behind it is. If you can explain it, then you've won half the battle.
Yeah, a big piece of writing this reserve fund policy was we had a really good team, and we got along well and really tried to carefully craft the language, because there's no surefire way to explain the purpose of your reserve fund so that nobody will complain. That's not possible. But we really did try to make sure these reserve fund types and the example language we gave is attempting to, in plain language, explain what these funds are for. That way, when library trustees, library directors get questions about why they have reserve funds on hand, it can be clearly explained what that money is for.
Mm-hmm. So, having a good policy is incredibly important, and it does let you fall back on that. It's important that your board really understands your policy as well, and any investment plans that you have. So it is good financial planning. Citizens and politicians can and sometimes will actually ask you about why you actually have money left on June 30th. This has been an increasing conversation that we've been hearing about amongst our legislators. Many of them really don't understand our revenue flow. They really don't understand how libraries operate. So when they see money available at the end of the year, they don't know we have to go 6 months until we receive a tax distribution and we can start operating outside of our reserves again. Being able to demonstrate that to them in clear language is really helpful. Sound policy can also lower borrowing costs in a couple of ways. One is if you have a capital reserve fund set up and you're planning to do a construction project, you may have set aside 20% or 40% of the cost of your construction. That, of course, means you're going to borrow less money. Sound reserve policy can also positively affect your bond rating or the interest rates that you're granted through your lending organization.
We defined 3 reserve fund types, and these reserve fund types can have different names. And I've heard a rainy day fund used for operational or emergency, but We chose these names for our example because we felt like they differentiated each one pretty well, and were, again, plain language explaining what they were for. So the most common elements are an operational reserve fund, an emergency fund, and a capital or construction fund.
You went 2 there. Okay. Before we go forward, I will ask if there are any questions. We're going to start getting into the weeds here in just a second. If there are any questions and you want to type them into the chat box, that's great. I'm just going to continue talking until they pop up. So an operational reserve fund, that's the one I referenced the most already. And it basically bridges the gap between July 1st and when you receive your first tax distribution, normally in December. Typically, you're going to define that within your policy in terms of the number of months. We have 6 months defined in our policy manual. It's very clear. There really is no question that need be had based on that. Our policy also references the very notion that we have to wait until December because our tax distributions aren't coming in then. So again, anybody reading our policy would clearly understand the purpose and the rationale. I don't know, Chris, if you had anything to add on to that.
Only that the typical number would be 6 months, maybe 7, maybe 8. If you're a really small library, it might make sense to be a little bit, have a little bit longer amount of time. Occasionally, the tax money comes in even later than December. And finally, most people may not remember this, but when I was starting out, traveling around the state, it really wasn't that uncommon to hear libraries having to borrow money sometime in the fall to get through till their tax money came in. I didn't understand it because I was so green at that point, but I would hear libraries talk about going to the bank, getting a bridge loan, and borrowing money. They would have to pay it back at interest to get through to the end of the year. So it's not an imaginary thing. You have no income for the first 6 months, and you've got to be able to somehow pay for that.
Right. I would anticipate that at least the majority, if not all, libraries do receive a very large tax distribution, large in terms of their total amount, percentage of total amount in December. It's possible that some counties may experience something different, so you'll just want to analyze the amount that you normally bring in December or January or February and set that number of months accordingly. So we talked about this the notion that our fiscal year begins July 1st. Bulk of the library's revenues are expected 6 months later in December. So we bridge that gap. The Board of Trustees really does need to define your policy, of course. You need to codify in there with the number of months. This is being repetitive, but 6 months is pretty much the standard amount of time. But again, you will want to look at your revenue flow and set that number of months accordingly. Still up. Okay, so the emergency reserve fund. This is money that you need to have available, or mostly available, should any kind of an emergency happen. And when I say mostly available, it might be tied up in a CD or semi-inaccessible, but you need to be able to access the money relatively quickly. Unforeseen expenses like a roof replacement, or replacing an HVAC unit, or if you have to have some major work done in an area that you just didn't expect. It's important to have access to those funds. Again, if you end up having to take out a loan to cover those costs, it's not the end of the world. However, paying back money at interest in the end only costs the taxpayers more. And if you can plan for it ahead of time, it's a good practice. You typically set your reserve fund in terms of dollars. Our board has designated $200,000 that we have set aside that at any given time we can get our hands on. Smaller or larger libraries may need more or less depending upon the age of their building, the age of the physical plant, or any other number of possible considerations. Chris, you deal with construction a lot. You may have more to add to this than I put in there.
That was really good. I think a common range would be for a really small library, maybe 150,000 would be a fairly small number at the low end of the spectrum. It could go up to $250,000 or maybe more if you had multiple buildings. And the fact of the matter is, we're in Kentucky. Any one of us sitting here today could be without a roof before this webinar is over if the right kind of storm blows in. Same thing with your HVAC. So that's why this money, this reserve fund is so important.
And I will say, I mean, we do all have insurance. When we did our construction project here, we had 3 calamities of various intensity. And I will say, fortunately, our insurance company was exceptional to work with, and we really had no upfront costs. Your mileage is going to vary based upon what happens, who's at fault, and I guess the kindness of your insurance company and their willingness to get moving really quickly. Not having money set aside is not the best planning if you're actually able to set money aside for this fund. So we really recommend it. Okay, and mentioned here, it'll be used for unforeseen emergencies. Library Board of Trustees, again, is going to designate specifically in your policy how much to keep in the fund. Again, we designated $200,000. Thankfully, we've not had to pull any money from that. However, at some point we may actually need to. One thing that our policy mentions is that the funds should be evaluated annually to confirm that it's still adequate to deal with foreseeable and unforeseeable emergencies. It's kind of hard to guess, I know, but it really is important to keep those things in mind. And I would say as your building ages, the amount of money you have in reserve may actually increase. If you replace all of your HVAC equipment one year, KDLA has been great and they've given a grant to do that. You might be able to lower the amount in your reserve fund for a period of time, but you really need to take a cold, hard look at the status of all of your facilities and the services and whatnot that you're offering, and then make a decision and evaluate that each year.
A couple of last thoughts. While you can borrow money, this would simplify the process if the money's just there. And similarly, even if you're going to eventually be reimbursed by insurance, knowing that you have the money to replace a roof when the weather's starting to get into your building could be a comfort. And of course, if your roof just wears out or your HVAC just quits running, that's insurance isn't going to cover that. So just trying to help make sure folks understand what these reserve funds are for. Again, the most important element is that most libraries, I think, in Kentucky these days do have a reasonable reserve fund. And occasionally, it's not that common, but occasionally local legislators, state legislators will question it, and you need to be able to explain what that money is for. Moving on to capital and construction reserves, since we don't see any questions so far. The Construction Reserve Fund is a long-term savings to prepare for planned renovation, expansion, etc. This would most typically be defined as an amount equal to a percentage of your total annual expenditures that are added to the reserve each year. So, assuming that you adopted a reserve fund policy, the most typical way of making sure you've met those amounts is that you would first fill your operational reserve, because every year you're going to need that money just to bridge that funding gap until your tax money starts coming in. So if you set that at, call it $500,000, then the next reserve fund that you would start to fill would be your emergency fund, and that might be a couple of $100,000 there. This fund, because it's probably going to be built up over a period of time, you would just say, having all of the reserve funds meet their goal, then we will take 8% of our annual budget amount and have that in reserve to be added for a capital construction project at some point in the future. if a large capital construction project moves into an active planning process, then you can update the amount so that you're reflecting the appropriate preparation for that project. It should be remembered that this fund should not be used to accumulate funds beyond those projected for a specific project. The reason that that final language is there, and why I think this particular fund is so important to look at very carefully, is we have a library or two in the state that have pretty large reserve funds available, and it's in their capital reserve fund. Well, you don't want to just keep adding money there, because if you have a library that's 3 or 4 years old, your population isn't growing radically, you're in a pretty comfortable spot. You probably don't need to be doing a huge construction project anytime soon. And if you're adding $100,000 or $200,000 to your capital reserve fund every year with no plausible project needing to be done, there's a risk that a county judge, fiscal court, state legislators can start looking at what you're doing and why you're setting your tax rate where you are. So you really want to set these numbers at reasonable amounts that you're able to justify, and you want to plan your capital construction reserve fund around a practical target of when you're going to need to be doing a building or an expansion or something of that nature. Do you have anything you want to add there, Mark, before we go to the...
I will say we tend to think, and expansively may not be the right word, but I'll use it a little more expansively in terms of this. For us, we think of capital projects in quite a few dollars less than a building addition or a renovation. I mean, we will pull things like carpet replacement for this. Replacing computers can come out of this fund. We're looking at getting a new bookmobile in the next year or so. That will likely come out of this fund as well. We have some carpet replacement that needs to happen. There's a fence outside that needs to be replaced. So even lower dollar things, we do try to identify and pull out of this fund, because they're not really the kind of things that we would budget in any one single year necessarily. It is a capitalizable expense, and it really could come out of this fund without any issue. We also have a clause in our policy that basically says if the fund ever reaches more than 4 months of our operating expenses, that the library board will look at measures to reduce it, which could include reducing our tax rates. Obviously, if we were planning on a construction project, we would quote extenuating circumstances and disregard that. But under normal times, 4 months of our operating expense is plenty to have in a capital reserve fund. So we have something which triggers the board to actually review. I will mention with boards, each of us have new board members coming on every year or two. I think it's really important for them to understand the ins and outs of your finances and the ins and outs of your reserve funds. So please, when you bring them on, make sure you sit down and really talk with them about it, and talk with them about your initiatives and your plans. And if you're planning a construction project, make sure they understand what costs you're potentially looking at and why you're setting those funds aside. Because, ultimately, they're the ones who oftentimes are going to be speaking with your magistrates or your county judge or some of your elected officials, and you may not even hear about it until they tell you, or maybe they don't tell you about it, and you hear about it through the grapevine, or maybe not at all. But they're often having conversations like that, and if they're informed, they will represent you well. If they're uninformed, it's not going to look good on the library.
Hear, hear. All right, so all of these example policies are intended as sample language that you can use as boilerplate to start your own local policy, and you can adapt it. But in this version, Capital reserve will be used to support long-term capital improvements, including yada, 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 all those that Mark just mentioned. Board of Trustees may consult with financial advisors, architects, or other consultants to determine capital needs over a 10-year period. This fund may also be used to pay off bonds for construction or land acquisition projects. Whoops.
Sorry.
Money will be added to this fund as they are available. After other funds have met targeted goals listed above, an amount equal to X percentage of total annual expenditures will be added each year. If a large project moves into active planning, this policy will be updated to reflect appropriate financial preparation. The number that I would have in mind, if you were, you're in Joe Kentucky Library and you have a decent building, but you know that in 10 or 15 years you might need to be doing an expansion or some kind of major replacement. And the number that I have in mind would be something like 7 to 8% of your total annual expenditure. That number is based only on me looking at several different example libraries that I consider to be representative of a typical Kentucky library, and just kind of doing a little bit of very simple math of if they saved X amount over X period of years, how much would they have after 10 or 15 or 20 years? So I think if you're don't have a specific project in mind, which might require more, but you do know that on a fairly, long 10 to 15 year time frame, you're probably going to need to start looking at doing a major project, then to save 7 or 8% is probably reasonable and probably not going to grow this fund faster than you're able to rationally explain to people that might ask questions about it. One thing, of course, that if people do not want to understand, it's not going to help. But as Mark was saying, if you and your trustees, some of whom may be in this meeting, are able to really understand why the money is there and what it's intended for, then that's going to give you an opportunity or the ability to explain what it's for to those who do want to understand. That's Mark.
So there are potential other types of reserve funds if you want to set them up. Technology replacement could be one. We roll that into our capital fund. It's the same with vehicle replacement. But if for some reason you wanted to split that out and target that and draw direct attention to that, which is not a bad thing, that kind of transparency is good, you could certainly set up that kind of a reserve fund as well. The final type, pension fund liability, there was agreement and disagreement in our core group when we were discussing reserves. We actually created a pension reserve fund here in Bourbon County. It was at the recommendation of a financial advisor as well as our auditor, who said it was a good idea. I think times have changed a little bit. Our pension system has been shorn up a fair amount, and we may see, I hope at some point in the fairly near future, the ability and need to sunset it. But for those of you who are directors or not and know anyway, when we're audited, most of us are audited annually. Some of us are, is it every 4 years, Chris?
Correct.
Okay, either annually or every 4 years. One of the things that is reported in the audit is the library's proportional share of pension liability. And basically that means if the state went belly up, we would have to pay a certain amount of that money that is owed through the pension system. And it's not an insignificant amount. Ours is well over $1 million, well over. And, we don't have that kind of money lying around. There was a time when I think people were actually taking bets on whether Kentucky's pension system would go under. And because of that, we did create our reserve fund, and we've set aside several $100,000 in that We never planned on funding 100% of it, but we did plan on funding a significant portion so that should it go belly up, we would be able to pay for a large portion and then probably pay the rest out over time. It does look better now in terms of the financial landscape for the pension system, so we may deplete that fund and reallocate those funds to another reserve. For now, we've still got it in place. It's still there as a legacy.
So we felt like with the three example fund types that we created, if a library had another fund type that they wanted to create, it would give a template that they could pick which flavor was most appropriate and then adapt it and have language there to start working from. I think Boone County may have a technology replacement fund as a separate designated fund, but as Mark said earlier, you could also fold some of these into a capital reserve too, because they, vehicles, technology, all those things are something you might capitalize over time. Moving along. Once reserve targets are met, total library income should be examined with a qualified financial planner to project ongoing needs. If income is projected to regularly exceed what is required for the expenditures and reserve goals enumerated, the board should consider a plan to adjust tax rates over time to more accurately match library income with needs. So, old dogs like me and Mark remember when it was pretty uncommon for a Kentucky Public Library to even consider taking less than the compensating rate. It wasn't that long ago, it was probably 15 years ago, KDLA was still always recommending very firmly, you need to take the 4%. In the last 10 or 12 years, I think things have kind of really reached a point where Kentucky libraries have on a lot more solid financial footing. Most of them, not all, but most are on a pretty solid financial footing. We have really great directors and really great trustees that are all very capable and doing a great job. So to have that rule of thumb that you just take at least the compensating rate, or as I said, we used to tell people you have to take the 4%. One big piece of this whole reserve fund policy conversation that we had 3 or 4 years ago was that some libraries were starting to be so well funded that it was raising questions from legislators and local officials. So you want to do this very carefully, because if you lower your rate quickly, you can't just put it back and say, whoops, we cut ourselves too short and we need to go back. Once you lower your rate, you can only, the compensating rate is only going to be aimed at getting the target that you hit last year. So you want to do it carefully. But as we're seeing fairly commonly now, there's a fair number of libraries that don't even need to take the compensating rate. And that's a good thing. If your library is paying your staff well, is providing the programs that you think it needs, and you have an adequate reserve fund for all of your projects and things you need to be prepared for, then it may be time to look at where your tax rate is set. So this evaluation element is a piece that we feel is important, and you can always contact Mark or me. We'd be glad to work with your library if you're working on a reserve fund policy or want to think a little bit more about how to do this. You can talk to your regional consultant from KDLA, and they can also have input on how you want to set your reserve funds and your total tax income. One final thought that I don't think gets its own slide is, by setting these reserve funds, you're not locked into anything. As with any other policy that your library sets, if needs change, if the situation changes, then the board can follow your process to change policies, and you can transfer money from one reserve fund type to another. You can raise the amount, you can lower the amount. So you're not locking yourself into anything. This is just planning.
Yeah, I'll mention with regards to lowering tax rates, we're kind of in a situation where we probably need to more significantly lower our rates than we have. We have been trying to lower them a little bit each year. The past couple of years, we've seen a situation in which interest rates on CDs and other revenue generating items has been really high. And, it would be silly of us not to invest the money that we're able to, because I think that's doing it's doing what we should for our taxpayers. We're generating interest and we're not thereby having to tax them even more. We recognize that interest rates are going to be coming down, so we've been pretty cautious in reducing our rates. So again, being cognizant of what's going on financially in the world around you and planning accordingly makes good sense.
I'll let you lead on this, Mark.
Okay, I think we mostly answered a lot of this, but just in terms of budgeting, every year we have to file a budget, and as much as we can plan for things, the better. Targeting your income to your programmatic needs is important. Doing 5-year planning or longer with your board, with other interested stakeholders, and with financial planners can help, and it can really help you identify some long-term goals and especially long-term expenses. And as Chris had mentioned, it's really important not to lower your rates without really understanding what your projections are going to be looking like over the next couple of years. It might be that you desperately need a new position, and you can't fund it this year or next year, but by the 3rd year, financially, you'll be able to. And keep that in mind as you're looking at your rates, and be prepared to defend taking in a little additional revenue for a couple of years until you're to the point that you can hire that teen librarian or whatever it is that you need, and then be prepared to explain why that position is so important to your library and to the community that you're serving.
If you are at a point where you are considering taking less than the compensating rate, you can always contact KDLA. For now, at least this year, we were doing the calculations on that, and Nicole was able, if you wanted to do an alternate rate, to run the calculation just to get a little backup on doing the math. As I said, because you can't undo it, you definitely want to make sure that it's incremental and carefully calculated. You can, if you're decent at math, you can do kind of a back of the envelope calculation at a board meeting or whatever while you're talking about it to get an idea of how much a rate change would bring in. But you definitely want to do the math very thoroughly before you actually adopt a different number. Okay, this is one of my little concerns. While it is perfectly legal and reasonable to pay off your debt early, and you can use your capital reserve fund to do that, I like to just offer a word of caution about paying off debt early. Trustees and all of us are correct in knowing that if you pay off a debt early, that will save you in costs and interest money. That's just a fact. Here's a counter argument for why you may not want to pay off your debt early if you're finding that your reserve funds are building up faster than you want. If you're finding that your reserve funds are building up really quickly, an obvious thing that a lot of libraries consider is, oh, we can take that extra money and we can pay down our debt and we'll pay off our loan early. The reason that I get nervous about that is if you borrow money over 20 years and are using that money to pay for a construction project, that's kind of similar to a common lifespan for an expansion or a building project. And if you can, make your payments over a period of time to pay down that debt, by the time it's finally paid off, then you may be needing to borrow money again. And it's a way of taking your steady state income and using it over at a steady rate over a long period of time to fund all of your capital needs. If you do find that you're having a kind of extra money at the end of the year that you don't have a place for, and you use it to pay down debt, once that debt goes away, now you're really going to be radically increasing how much you're going to be adding to your reserve fund each year. And there could become a pressure to lower your tax rates more than are going to help be sustainable when you do need to do an expansion. So it's just something to consider. It's not at all uncommon for libraries to refinance debt. It's not at all uncommon or unreasonable for libraries to pay debt off early. But it is worth considering, are there also advantages, even though it will cost some interest money, to spread out your payments and kind of normalize them over the long period of time? I'll quit preaching.
So I think that's about all we have, Chris.
Yeah. Do we have any questions?
As we wait and hopefully get some questions, I will mention if anybody would like a copy of our reserve policies, just reach out to me. I'm happy to send them to you. I'm sure if you post in the director's listserv, you'll get lots of responses as well.
And the policy you saw here today is available on the KDLA website.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, please feel free to unmute and ask a question or add a question in the chat. While people are thinking, here's our contact information. I'm sure that Mark or I would be glad to talk to you. And this, as I said, I've held on to a piece of my statewide role when I was construction consultant. So I still talk to folks about their bricks and mortar construction questions, and also procurement and reserve fund. I've also continued to consult on occasionally statewide. So don't ever hesitate to call me. And if you'd like for me to call into a board meeting, if you were talking about reserve funds, I'd be glad to do that.
Okay, so Tina asked how we figured the pension liability fund. To be honest, there really was no black magic behind it. We just, as we set up all of the other funds, Chris kind of gave an order in which you fund them. And pension liability was the last in order. And basically we had X number of dollars left after we'd funded the other ones. So that's how much we put in there. It was $200,000. So that's what we said as our initial balance. We've added 100,000 since then. To be honest, we generally don't have a whole lot of money to put into that fund because the other funds necessarily gobble up our extra carryover at the end of the year. But as money has been available, we have put it in there. And again, it's at this point, I don't know whether the pension liability fund is as necessary. That would certainly be a discussion to have with your auditor, perhaps, or with a financial planner. But for us at the time, it really did seem important, and it's something that we did.
I think one assumption we had about pension liability was if something horrific happened, the state goes bankrupt, the retirement fund goes bankrupt, and libraries are called upon to contribute, it was assumed that there would probably be some period of time, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that local governments like libraries would be allowed to pay their liability over time and not just say, okay, today you owe me $1 million. So I think that was part of it. But yeah, we didn't have any specific formula that anybody had been given or figured out.
Okay, so Jamie was asking about, do we have a set percentage allocated for each type of reserve fund, or do you just evaluate each year as needed? Well, the operational reserve fund, for us, since it's 6 months, it's it's kind of a set amount. We use 50% of what our operating expenses will be for the year, recognizing that we probably spend a little more than 50% during the first 6 months. You may have a different experience, but for us that's the case. But we just do 50% of what it would cost for us to operate in that year's budget. The emergency reserve, it's set at $200,000. We've never raised it and we've never lowered it. We would evaluate, or we do evaluate that each year, but we've never seen the need to change it. The capital facility, our policy says an amount up to 8% of total annual expenditures will be added. If there's not 8% available, we can't add that, but we would do up to 8%. Then if there was money available beyond that, that would roll over into the pension liability reserve. If we had a significant amount of money beyond that, that's what would trigger the board kind of looking at do we really need to be bringing in this much money because our reserves are growing too quickly. So it's kind of a mix of things.
Sorry, Mark, to expand on that. So it would be a set amount, but how you define it is usually varies depending on the fund type. So usually a number of months that you want to be able to operate on your operational reserve, typically 6 months. A set dollar amount for your emergency fund, usually $150,000 to $250,000, and then a percentage beyond that in the construction fund. And I think it's probably most common to evaluate that every year, but it's not at all common for them to change very fast because this is a very long-term strategic kind of planning that you're doing. So it's not something that would typically be evolving at a very fast rate, but you could change it when you need to.
Right. And I would say tangential to this, it is important that your board evaluate every single policy that you have on an annual basis. I don't think KDLA asks that anymore, but that used to be one of the things that KDLA or KPLA or both would ask is, how frequently you examine your policies, and your reserve policies should be looked at every year to make sure that they are meeting your needs.
It's not documented on the annual report, but we still consider reviewing your policies each year to be a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right. Do we have any additional questions? If so, please feel free to unmute or add them in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, I would like to thank both of our speakers for today, Mark and Chris. Thank you so much for all of this helpful information and for volunteering to be a resource in the future to others. We really appreciate that. Today's webinar has been recorded. There is a survey available that we appreciate if you complete. It's just a brief 4 questions survey that's available in the Blackboard course shell as well as the PDF document from today's webinar. Certificates of attendance will be sent out to all participants within a week of the webinar, as well as the archived version for those who were not able to attend or those who would like to attend in the future. That will also be available beginning next week. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday.
I hope